trapped in the shadows, the haunting of Idaho's lost cabin. Sometimes I think back and wonder how different things would have been if we'd just stuck to the original plan. It was supposed to be a simple, quick camping trip in the woods, a little adventure to shake things up. Nothing more. My friends and I, Matt, Danny, and Chris, had spent weeks planning it. We'd even mapped out a trail and found a secluded spot where we could camp out under the stars. But once we stumbled on that old cabin, we made the biggest mistake of our lives. The cabin wasn't on our map. We had no clue it existed, and there was no reason for it to be out here in the depths of an untouched forest in northern Idaho. But there it was, an old rickety structure standing alone between the trees, looking like it was straight out of some horror movie. Most people would have walked away, but not us. Danny grinned and said, "Come on, we have to check it out. Who gets a chance like this?" And I won't lie, I was curious too. A night in a forgotten cabin? It sounded like something that would make a story worth telling. The place was small and cramped, and the air felt heavy the moment we stepped inside. The walls were old, and everything smelled damp, with an odd metallic tang that stuck in the back of my throat. The windows were caked with grime, letting in barely any light, and yet we felt drawn to it, as if the cabin was somehow holding us there. We settled in around a makeshift campfire in the center of the room, joking and laughing to shake off the eerie vibe. Chris was making dumb ghost jokes, trying to freak us out, but it wasn't working, at least not yet. Because as the fire flickered, we all started noticing something odd. Shadows were moving along the walls, like there was an extra shadow behind each of us. I brushed it off as a trick of the light, but a gnawing feeling of unease was growing inside me, and then the whispers started. It was faint at first, like a barely audible murmur that blended in with the crackling fire. We paused, and for a moment the silence was absolute. We looked at each other, waiting for someone to break the tension, but the whispering continued, rising from the corners of the room like a soft, haunting chant. The words were unintelligible, distorted, as if they were coming from somewhere deep within the walls. We tried to laugh it off, telling ourselves it was just the wind, but there wasn't a hint of breeze. Not a single leaf moved outside. Matt made another joke, but his voice shook a little, and that's when I knew he was just as freaked out as I was. I think we all knew, deep down, that something was wrong with that place, but none of us wanted to be the first to admit it, so we ignored it, trying to fall asleep in the dark. But sleep never came easily that night. When I finally drifted off, I had the most vivid, gut-wrenching nightmare. I dreamt I was trapped inside the walls of the cabin, watching my friends move around the room, unable to scream or make a sound. I could feel every inch of the cramped, suffocating space around me, and the only thing I could do was watch as they sat by the fire, completely unaware that I was right there, just beyond the walls. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. But when I looked over at Danny and Chris, I realized they had woken up too, their faces pale and terrified. We exchanged glances, and without even asking, I knew. They'd had the exact same dream. Danny tried to rationalize it, saying it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. Maybe something we ate that was messing with our heads. But I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe a word of it, and neither did I. As the night wore on, we huddled closer together, our eyes fixed on the walls, as if we expected something to burst out from within them. The whispers kept returning, growing louder each time. Every time we thought they'd stopped, they'd start again, even clearer than before, each of us hearing our own names being called out from somewhere inside the cabin. By the time dawn came, we were at the edge of our sanity. Chris, always the skeptical one, was visibly shaking, and Matt kept muttering to himself. But when we tried to leave, we discovered something even worse. The cabin wouldn't let us out. Every time we tried the door, we'd end up back in the same room like we were trapped in some endless loop. We tried everything, opening windows, kicking down the door, but it was no use. No matter what we did, we were stuck, pulled back by an invisible force that held us there, like the cabin itself was alive and intent on keeping us. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped in some twisted nightmare. The sun was up, but it did nothing to lift the darkness that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The shadows grew thicker, more distorted, moving closer, and the whispers now turned into shrieks, like the sound of tortured souls calling out from a place beyond our reach. Then suddenly the shadows began to take shape. They rose from the walls, elongated, twisted figures with hollow, gaping eyes that bore into our very souls. I knew right then that these weren't just shadows. They were things, entities that had somehow become part of the cabin, feeding on our fear, waiting for the moment to drag us down with them. Chris screamed first, making a break for the door, but as soon as he stepped outside, we watched in horror as he looped right back inside, standing at the entryway as if he'd never left. He tried again and again, each time ending up in the exact same place, a look of despair slowly overtaking his face as he realized he couldn't escape. I don't know what came over me, but I started to feel my body go numb, like I was fading, dissolving into the darkness around us. The shadows were closing in, and I knew, with a dread unlike anything I'd ever felt, that we were becoming one of them. One by one, my friends began to lose themselves in the darkness, their faces frozen in silent screams as they were swallowed by the walls, disappearing into the twisted shadows that had tormented us all night. And that was when I finally understood. This cabin, it was a trap, a place meant to lure people in, to claim their souls and turn them into shadows bound forever to its walls. We weren't the first, and I knew we wouldn't be the last. I tried to fight it, to keep myself from slipping away, but it was no use. The darkness had me. My last memory is the feeling of being pulled deeper into the walls, watching helplessly as the room faded around me. And now, I'm here, waiting in the shadows, watching, forever part of this cabin, unable to escape. So if you ever find yourself in the deep woods of Idaho and come across an old, decrepit cabin, don't go in. Don't make the mistake we did. Because once you enter, there's no turning back.
The Cabin of Lost Voices, a weekend to forget. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. After months of arguments and tension, Kyle and I decided that a few days alone, deep in the woods, might be what we needed to reconnect. I wanted to believe that a break from everything, work, phones, other people, could bring us back together. Kyle had rented a small, secluded cabin in upstate New York, far enough from the nearest town that we'd have total privacy. I tried to focus on the positives as we drove up. Trees, a lake nearby, and the smell of pine everywhere. But there was something about the forest that felt heavy as we got closer, like it was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tense from the drive. The cabin looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. It was small, wooden, and perched on a slight hill, surrounded by thick trees. Everything around it was quiet. Too quiet. Kyle didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he hid it well. He was cheerful, practically whistling as he unloaded the car and set up inside. I tried to match his mood, but something in me felt unsettled. Maybe it was just nerves about the weekend. We hadn't been able to talk without arguing in months. That first night, we built a small fire, opened a bottle of wine, and tried to relax. For the first time in a long time, things felt almost normal between us. But then, as we sat in silence, I heard something. A faint whispering, like distant voices echoing through the cabin. I glanced at Kyle, expecting him to notice, but he just stared into the fire. Maybe it was my imagination, I told myself. But the voices continued, low and insistent. and I felt a chill creep over me. Later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to sleep, but the silence of the cabin felt oppressive, like it was pressing in on me. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it was clearer, almost like someone was standing right outside our window murmuring. I held my breath, straining to hear, and then I heard it. My name, whispered low and drawn out, like a warning. I jolted up in bed, staring around the room. The moonlight cast long shadows across the walls, and the trees outside swayed gently in the night breeze. Kyle stirred beside me, but didn't wake up. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. I lay back down, but my heart was pounding, and every sound seemed to echo, filling the room. The next morning, Kyle acted like nothing was wrong, but I was on edge. I didn't tell him what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. We spent the day walking along a narrow trail around the lake and cooking over the fire. Kyle was relaxed, enjoying himself, and for a few hours, I managed to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But that night, the voices returned. This time they were louder, clearer. I heard my name again, and then, to my horror, I heard Kyle's. I reached over and shook him awake, my voice trembling as I told him what I'd heard. "Come on, Emily," he said, his voice groggy. "It's probably just the wind. We're in the middle of the woods. Relax." But his words didn't comfort me. I knew what I'd heard, and it was too real, too close. I lay awake, listening, while Kyle drifted back to sleep. Hours seemed to pass as I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the whispers to start again. And then, as I was finally beginning to relax, they did. This time they were louder, like someone was right in the room with us, speaking in a low, almost hissing voice. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat, and felt a chill wash over me. Kyle sat up too, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. We listened, our bodies tense, as the whispers grew louder, filling the room. They seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing off the walls and pressing in on us. I grabbed Kyle's hand, squeezing it tightly. I didn't know what else to do. And then the voices changed. They weren't just whispering our names anymore. They were saying things, dark things, secrets only Kyle and I knew about each other, secrets we'd never shared with anyone. Kyle pulled me close, his voice barely a whisper. "Emily, we have to get out of here." We grabbed what we could and made our way to the door. But when Kyle tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. He tugged harder, throwing his weight against it, but it was like something was holding it shut. The whispers grew louder, almost angry, filling every inch of the cabin with a pressure that felt like it was crushing us. I looked at Kyle, panic clear in his eyes. For the first time, I could see that he was just as scared as I was. He grabbed a chair and tried to break the window, but it was no use. The glass wouldn't shatter, and the whispers only intensified, filling my mind with memories I'd tried to forget, dark things that I'd kept buried. I looked at Kyle, and for a moment he seemed different, like a stranger. The whispers seemed to be in his voice now, echoing my own worst thoughts back at me. I backed away, unsure of what to believe. Kyle reached for me, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place as the voices filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. And then, out of nowhere, they stopped. The cabin fell silent, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I looked at Kyle. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, his face pale. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling. I can still hear them." I tried to shake him, to make him snap out of it, but he just kept staring, his eyes glazed over, as if he were trapped somewhere far away. The whispers began again, and this time they were different, softer, but darker. They were coming from inside his head, and I could see him fighting against them, his face contorted with fear. And then, slowly, he turned to me, his expression twisted, a look of rage in his eyes. "This is your fault," he said, his voice cold, unfamiliar. "You brought us here. You knew." I stumbled back, horrified. "Kyle, what are you talking about? I didn't—" But he just kept coming closer, his face twisted with anger, his voice filled with accusation. "You knew," he hissed. "You brought me here on purpose." I tried to back away, to get as far from him as I could, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin seemed to close in around us, the walls pressing in, the voices filling every corner, whispering, accusing. I could feel them inside my head now, twisting my thoughts, making me doubt everything. I didn't know what was real anymore. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I looked around, but Kyle was gone. I was alone in the cabin, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I searched every corner, calling his name, but there was no answer. It was like he had vanished, swallowed up by the darkness. I stumbled outside, desperate for air, and found myself standing in the clearing, surrounded by the trees. The night was silent, the sky clear, and the cabin stood behind me, dark and empty. I called his name again, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it. The faint sound of laughter, echoing through the night, like a distant memory that wouldn't let go. I knew then that Kyle was gone, taken by whatever darkness had haunted that cabin. And as I stood there, alone in the darkness, I realized that part of me had been taken too. I ran, my heart pounding, leaving the cabin behind. But even now, I can still hear the whispers, following me, haunting me, reminding me of the things I'd rather forget. And every night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I hear them call my name.
The Night Watcher, a writer's retreat gone wrong. Writing is hard work, and sometimes the only way to make progress is to lock yourself away with your thoughts, somewhere far from the distractions of daily life. I'd been struggling with my novel for months, hitting dead end after dead end, so when I heard about a cabin rental way out in the woods of Oregon, I jumped at the chance. Just me, my laptop, and the quiet sounds of nature. I figured it was exactly what I needed. The drive took longer than I'd expected, winding through empty roads and dense forests. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy, tucked between towering pines. It had that rustic, almost haunted vibe that you'd expect in some old horror movie, but I shrugged it off. I was here to work, and the cabin's eerie appearance was just a bonus. If anything, it would give me a little inspiration. The first thing I noticed as I stepped inside was the silence. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing down on you, the kind you only get when you're miles from civilization. The cabin was small, just one large room with a bed, a table, and a fireplace. A single window faced the dense trees, and I couldn't help but feel like the forest was watching me. I set my bags down, unpacked my laptop, and got to work. It was dark within an hour, so I lit the fireplace, the flickering glow casting shadows across the room. I tried to ignore the shadows, focusing on the words in front of me, but every now and then I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just shadows from the fire, I told myself, shifting on the wall. Hours passed, and I was lost in my work. For the first time in months, the words were flowing. But then, a noise outside pulled me from my focus. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor somewhere close to the cabin. I stopped typing, listening. The sound continued, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I sat there, frozen, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps were heavy, like they belonged to someone or something big. I shook my head, laughing nervously. "Come on, man. You're just scaring yourself," I whispered. It was probably a deer or some other animal, curious about the light. But the footsteps continued, and a chill ran down my spine. They were too steady, too purposeful. Whoever was out there knew I was inside, and they were circling me. I tried to ignore it, going back to my writing, but the thought of someone lurking just outside kept pulling my attention. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment the silence returned, but it felt different now, more intense, like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. Eventually, I managed to convince myself it was nothing and went to bed, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I left the fire burning low and the room filled with soft flickering light. I told myself I'd sleep better that way, that it would keep the shadows at bay. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening, every small creak and rustle keeping me wide awake. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of tapping on the window. It was soft, rhythmic, almost like someone drumming their fingers. My heart raced as I turned to look, but the darkness outside was too thick to see anything. I stayed perfectly still, my breath held, waiting for the tapping to stop. But it didn't. If anything, it got louder, more insistent. Finally, I gathered the courage to stand up and approach the window. I inched forward, my footsteps almost silent until I was close enough to peer out. My breath fogged up the glass, and for a second I thought I saw something. A face, half hidden in shadow, staring back at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty forest. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, my back to the wall, watching the room, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the sun started to rise, filling the cabin with light. The tension eased, and I laughed at myself, chalking it all up to my overactive imagination. A night alone in the woods was bound to mess with anyone's head. The next day was quiet. I wrote for hours, barely stopping to eat, but as night began to fall, I felt the unease creeping back. The memory of the tapping on the window, of that face, or whatever it was, stayed with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to push through it, lighting the fire and focusing on my work, but as the hours passed, the silence grew heavier, almost unbearable. And then, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, they were closer. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was out there was right on the other side of the wall. I could almost feel their presence, their weight pressing against the wood. The footsteps stopped, and I waited, barely breathing, my heart pounding. And then came the tapping. It was louder this time, more insistent, and it sounded like it was coming from every window, every wall, like I was surrounded. I backed into the corner, my eyes darting from one wall to the next, and that's when I saw it. There, just outside the window, was the face. Pale and ghostly, with hollow eyes and a wide, thin smile. The skin was stretched tight, almost like it wasn't really skin at all. The eyes, dark and empty, seemed to look right through me, and the smile, it was too wide, too unnatural. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. All I could do was stare back, trapped in its gaze, as it watched me through the glass. The tapping stopped, and the figure's face disappeared, but the relief was short-lived. Suddenly the doorknob rattled, like someone was trying to force their way in. I jumped up, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a fire poker, and stood by the door, ready to defend myself. The rattling stopped, and silence filled the cabin once more. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping the fire poker, waiting. Minutes, hours. It felt like time had frozen. but eventually exhaustion took over and I slumped to the floor, unable to keep my eyes open any longer. When I woke up, the sun was rising and everything was quiet. I packed my things as quickly as I could, barely stopping to grab breakfast. The cabin felt different in the daylight, almost normal, but I wasn't about to stick around and see what would happen when the sun went down again. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that face staring back at me from the back seat. Even now, weeks later, I still see it in my dreams, those empty, hollow eyes and that too wide smile. And every so often, when I'm alone at night, I hear tapping on the windows. I try to ignore it, tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know it's waiting.
The forest portal, lost in the shadows of Wolf Hollow. There's a certain thrill in exploring places that nobody's supposed to find. I'd always had a thing for urban exploration, abandoned houses, forgotten buildings, you name it. But this time, my friends and I took things a step further. We had heard rumors of a hidden cabin somewhere in Wolf Hollow, a dense forest up in northern Maine that's barely marked on any map. People said the cabin was used by some kind of group decades ago. Some whispered it was a cult. Others said it was a hideout for people who vanished from the grid. Either way, it sounded like exactly the kind of place I wanted to find. So, there we were. Me, Jack, Oliver, and Tyler, trekking through the thickest part of the forest, using some vague directions we'd pieced together from old blog posts and local rumors. Jack had packed a compass, but it was mostly for show. We knew we'd have to go off trail, deeper than we'd ever gone, but we were ready. Or at least, we thought we were. The forest had a strange vibe from the beginning. I don't know how to explain it, but there was this sense of quiet that wasn't normal, even for a place this isolated. No birds, no rustling leaves, just our footsteps crunching on the ground. Every now and then, we'd stop, listen, and exchange nervous glances. The air was cold and still, and as we walked, it felt like the trees were closing in on us. After hours of searching, when we were just about ready to turn back, Jack spotted it, a glimpse of weathered wood through the trees. We pushed forward, and there it was, the cabin, hidden in a grove, overgrown with ivy and surrounded by trees so thick you'd never know it was there unless you were right on top of it. It looked exactly like something out of a horror movie, with peeling paint, cracked windows, and an old stone chimney that seemed barely held together. We were too excited to feel nervous, at least at first. Tyler pulled out his camera, and we started taking photos, laughing about how we'd finally made it to the legendary cabin of Wolf Hollow. But as we got closer, I felt this chill settle over me. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swung with the breeze, as if someone, or something, was inviting us inside. The cabin's interior was cramped, dark, and covered in dust. Everything felt abandoned, like it had been forgotten for decades. But something didn't add up. There were strange markings on the walls, symbols scratched into the wood that looked almost like spirals, winding and twisting all the way up to the ceiling. I traced my fingers over one of them, feeling an icy sensation shoot up my arm. I pulled back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something we shouldn't have. As we moved deeper inside, we found an old, rickety staircase leading down to what seemed like a basement. Jack and Oliver were already heading down before I could protest, and Tyler and I exchanged a look. We'd come this far. There was no way we'd turn back now, so we followed them. The basement was even stranger than the cabin above. There were no windows, only bare concrete walls, and a damp smell that filled the air. In the center of the room was a single worn-out armchair, facing one of the walls. It was unsettling, as if someone had spent hours or even years just sitting there, staring at nothing. Tyler tried to lighten the mood by joking about ghosts, but his voice wavered, and I could tell he was as freaked out as I was. We took a few more pictures, looking for anything that would explain the markings on the walls, but then we heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps, coming from above us. We all froze, glancing at each other with wide eyes. Jack, who was usually the fearless one, held up his hand, signaling us to stay quiet. We waited, holding our breaths, listening. The footsteps grew louder, moving slowly across the floorboards above. It sounded like someone, or something, was walking through the cabin. We'd made sure we were alone, so the thought of someone else being out there was terrifying. Tyler whispered that it could be an animal, but deep down, I think we all knew that wasn't true. Then, as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on us like a weight. Oliver looked at us, his face pale. "Maybe we should go," he said, his voice barely audible. We moved toward the staircase, but the air felt thicker, harder to breathe, like something was holding us back. Just as Jack put his foot on the first step, we heard another sound, this time coming from the basement itself. It was a low, droning hum, growing louder and vibrating through the floor. It seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, filling every corner of the room. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness. My phone flashlight was useless. No matter where I pointed it, the darkness swallowed it whole. I could barely make out the shapes of my friends, all standing still, too scared to move. The humming sound grew louder, and then I noticed something even stranger. The spiral symbols on the walls. They were glowing, faintly at first, but getting brighter and brighter, like they were alive. "Let's go!" I shouted, pushing past Jack and sprinting up the stairs. We burst out of the basement, barely able to see in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. But as we reached the main room, the sight that met us made me stop, dead in my tracks. The cabin was different. The layout, the furniture, everything had changed, like we'd stepped into a completely different place. The walls were covered in more symbols, spirals overlapping each other, twisting and turning in every direction. And then we saw them, figures, standing in the corners of the room, silent and motionless. They were dark, shadowy shapes with hollow, empty eyes, watching us. Oliver was the first to scream, and his voice seemed to snap us out of our shock. We ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. Jack threw his weight against it, shouting in frustration, but it was like it was fused shut. The shadows began to move, creeping toward us with each heartbeat, their eyes locked on us, unblinking. We scrambled around, looking for another way out, when Tyler noticed a small window near the floor. Without thinking, he started kicking at it, desperate to break the glass. The shadows were nearly upon us now, filling the room with an unnatural cold. I could feel them, like their emptiness was trying to pull me in, to make me part of whatever nightmare they were trapped in. Finally, the window shattered, and we helped each other squeeze through, cutting ourselves on the broken glass as we scrambled to escape. We hit the ground outside and started running, not daring to look back. The forest was dark, disorienting, but we didn't stop. I could still feel the weight of those empty eyes on me, even as we put distance between us and the cabin. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the edge of the forest, collapsing on the ground, gasping for breath. When I looked back, I could barely see the outline of the cabin in the distance, hidden between the trees. But I knew it was still there, waiting, watching. We left Wolf Hollow that night and swore never to speak of what happened, but even now I can't escape the feeling that a part of me stayed behind. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that same humming sound, and I know that the shadows are still watching, waiting for me to come back.
The Hollow Watcher. A forest retreat gone wrong. I was never really the outdoorsy type, but after a year of non-stop work, burnout hit me hard. My older brother, Tom, kept telling me I needed to get out, disconnect, and give myself a break from the chaos of the city. He suggested we spend a weekend at a cabin he knew of in the Appalachian Mountains, deep in a part of North Carolina that's miles from anything resembling civilization. Just the two of us, he'd said. No phones, no laptops, no distractions. When I saw the cabin, I had to admit it was everything he promised. Peaceful, rustic, and secluded. The place sat at the edge of a dense forest that stretched out as far as the eye could see. No neighboring cabins, no sounds except for the wind in the trees. I took a deep breath, inhaling the clean mountain air, feeling some of the tension drain out of me. Maybe this weekend wouldn't be so bad. We unloaded the car and got settled inside. The cabin was cozy but showed signs of age, worn floorboards, faded wallpaper, and a musty smell that seemed permanently soaked into the wood. But it had a charm to it, and Tom immediately set about lighting a fire, joking that I'd be reborn as a mountain man by the end of the weekend. I just laughed it off and opened a beer, trying to adjust to the quiet. As night fell, the cabin took on a different feeling. The air got colder, heavier, and the quiet that had seemed peaceful during the day now felt oppressive. Tom didn't seem to notice. He was all smiles, rambling on about the hiking trails he wanted to explore the next day. But I was having trouble relaxing, like there was something off. The forest, visible through the windows, seemed darker than it should have been, like the trees were pressing closer to the cabin. Just as I was starting to shake off the feeling, we heard it, a low, distant humming sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as it grew louder, it became clear it was something else. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the woods. Tom brushed it off as forest sounds, saying that the mountain winds could be weird like that. But to me, it sounded like something was out there, just beyond the trees. We tried to ignore it, but the humming didn't stop. It ebbed and flowed, sometimes so faint we could barely hear it, other times loud enough to make the floor vibrate. Eventually, we turned in for the night, hoping it would stop by morning. I lay awake, listening, every now and then glancing toward the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me from the darkness. Sometime around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I held my breath, straining to hear, my mind racing. We were miles from the nearest town, and nobody knew we were here. I nudged Tom, whispering that someone was outside, but he just mumbled something incoherent, still half asleep. The footsteps stopped, and for a few seconds there was nothing but silence. Then, suddenly, there was a loud, sharp knock on the door. 3 distinct knocks, followed by complete silence. I felt a chill run down my spine, and every instinct in me screamed not to open the door. I tried to wake Tom again, but he was in too deep a sleep. Another knock echoed through the cabin, louder this time, almost angry. I got up, heart pounding, and tiptoed to the window, peeking out through the narrow gap in the curtains. The porch was empty, but as I scanned the trees, I thought I saw something, a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that looked wrong, stretched and unnatural, and it was staring right at me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer. It just stood there watching, as if waiting for me to come outside. I sat down, clutching my head, telling myself it was a nightmare, a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't going to leave. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, but the figure didn't move. When morning finally came, it was gone, as if it had never been there. I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, a mix of stress and the isolation getting to me. But that night, it returned. As soon as the sun went down, the humming started again, louder and more intense than before, filling the cabin with a low, haunting vibration. And then, just like the night before, I heard footsteps on the porch. I grabbed Tom, finally managing to wake him, and dragged him to the window. "Look," I whispered, my voice shaking. He stared out, his face going pale as he saw it, the same figure standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless, its eyes, or where the eyes should have been, locked onto us. Tom cursed under his breath. whispering that it had to be some kind of prank, maybe a lost hiker messing with us. But as we watched, the figure took a step forward, then another, moving in that same slow, deliberate way. Its limbs seemed to stretch with each step, bending at impossible angles. And then, just as it reached the edge of the porch, it stopped. We stayed frozen, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe. The figure tilted its head as if curious, and then, in a low, guttural voice, it spoke. "Why have you come?" The words weren't loud, but they seemed to fill the room, echoing in my head. I felt my legs give out and I sank to the floor, my mind racing. Tom was whispering something to himself, maybe a prayer, maybe just words to keep himself sane. The figure stood there for what felt like hours, its face a twisted mask of curiosity and malice. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it turned and disappeared into the trees. The humming faded, and the silence returned, but I knew it wasn't over. We packed our things at first light, neither of us saying a word. We drove in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. I thought that leaving the cabin, getting out of those woods, would make me feel safe. But even now, weeks later, I can still feel it watching me. I see it sometimes in my dreams, standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. I don't know what it wants, but I know one thing: I'll never go back. And if you ever find yourself near Wolf Hollow, near the dark heart of those mountains, I'd suggest you turn back, because something out there is watching and it doesn't want to be found.
Echoes in the Pines, the last night at Lakewood cabin. I don't know what it was that drew me to Lakewood cabin. It's not like I was looking for a creepy getaway. In fact, I'd planned the trip to get away from stress. My friends always joked that I needed to disconnect more, so when I saw a listing for an isolated cabin near a lake in the Adirondacks, I figured it would be the perfect place to clear my head. I could fish, hike, and finally find some peace. But I never expected that I'd come face to face with something I can't explain. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, nestled between thick woods and a quiet lake. It was late fall, and the leaves had just turned. The scenery was gorgeous, all reds and oranges, and the air was crisp. I'd picked up groceries on the way and planned on spending a week alone, just me and the lake, far from the noise of the city. When I got to the cabin, it was exactly as I'd pictured it, small, rustic, and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, which somehow made it even better. There was a feeling of stepping back in time. I unpacked, got a fire going, and settled in. For the first day, I just relaxed, enjoying the silence and the scenery. But that night, as the temperature dropped, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the cabin was unnaturally quiet. Even the usual sounds of a house settling or the wind against the walls were absent. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I just wasn't used to this level of isolation. So I grabbed a book and settled by the fire, trying to ignore the weird feeling. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. I was just starting to drift off when I heard something. It was faint at first, like a low hum coming from somewhere outside. I tried to ignore it, but it kept going, a slow, rhythmic sound that grew louder with every passing minute. It was almost like chanting, or no, more like a melody, but one that didn't quite belong. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to hear, and that's when I noticed it wasn't just any sound. It was a voice. I got up, heart racing, and went to the window, peeking out at the dark forest that surrounded the cabin. But there was nothing there, just shadows and moonlight filtering through the pines. I took a deep breath and convinced myself it was just the wind, maybe blowing through the trees in some weird way. The sound faded eventually, and I managed to get back to sleep, but the unease stayed with me. The next day, I explored the woods around the cabin, trying to enjoy the beauty of the lake and the quiet trails. But there was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that I was being watched. Every so often I'd stop and look over my shoulder, but there was never anything there, just me, alone in the silence. As night fell, the feeling of dread grew stronger. The fire crackled as I sat by the hearth, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that some sleep would help. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the sound returned. This time, it was louder. It was that same rhythmic, almost melodic humming, echoing through the trees like a whisper carried by the wind. I lay there, frozen, listening as it grew louder and closer. I could almost make out words, but they were garbled, impossible to understand, like a language I'd never heard. I pulled myself out of bed, my heart pounding, and went to the window again. And that's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too stretched, and it stood perfectly still, facing the cabin. I couldn't see its face, just a dark silhouette against the trees, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze boring into me even from that distance. I backed away from the window, feeling a wave of panic. Who could be out here, miles from civilization? And why were they just standing there? The humming continued, louder now, filling the cabin with that strange, haunting melody. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands over my ears, but the sound only seemed to grow. It felt like it was coming from inside my own head, like the figure was planting the tune directly into my mind. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run out the door and make a break for it, but something kept me rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer, but I could feel it there, like it was calling to me, pulling me toward the darkness of the woods. Finally, I forced myself to look out the window again, but the figure was gone. The humming faded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I sat by the fire, wide awake and terrified, listening to the silence and waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I went out to the edge of the woods where I'd seen the figure. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew it had been real, the fear, the humming. It was too vivid to be a dream. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but as night fell, the dread returned. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was just tired, that the isolation was getting to me. But as soon as darkness fell, the humming started again. I went to the window, and there it was, the figure standing in the exact same spot, watching me. This time, it was closer, and I could see it more clearly. Its limbs were twisted, elongated, like it had been stretched beyond human limits, and its face was blank, a smooth, pale surface with no features, just an empty, expressionless mask. I backed away, grabbing my keys and my coat. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I had to get out of there. I threw open the door, but the instant I stepped outside, the humming stopped. The figure was gone, as if it had melted back into the darkness. I froze, listening to the silence, feeling that heavy presence in the air, like it was still watching me, hidden among the trees. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to get in my car or go back inside. But then, just as I was about to leave, I heard it. A single whisper, my name, echoing through the trees. I turned, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the empty forest and the faint sound of the lake in the distance. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, watching the windows, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. By morning, the sense of dread had lifted, and the forest seemed almost peaceful again. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and left without looking back. It's been weeks since that night, but I can still hear the humming sometimes, a faint melody in the back of my mind. And every so often I see that figure in my dreams, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me with its blank, featureless face. I don't know what it was, or why it came to me. But I know one thing. I'll never go back to Lakewood Cabin. And if you're ever tempted to visit that place, to seek out the quiet isolation of the forest, I'd advise against it. Because once you hear that melody, it never leaves you.
The Watcher at Willow Lake, a cabin too far. I'd heard about Willow Lake Cabin from my buddy Nate, who'd rented it for a weekend a few years back. He said it was the best place to go if you wanted to disconnect from everything. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just pure, quiet wilderness. But the way he talked about it, there was something in his eyes. I couldn't tell if it was excitement or fear. He'd only ever been there once, and when I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said, "It's not for everyone." But I wanted to get away. I'd been working non-stop, and the city was starting to wear me down. I figured a few days alone by the lake, with nothing but my thoughts, would do me some good. So I booked Willow Lake Cabin, packed a few things, and drove up into the mountains of northern Washington. The drive took longer than I'd expected, and by the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already setting. The cabin was smaller than I'd pictured. It looked like it had been there for 100 years, tucked between tall pines and sitting right at the edge of the lake. The air was cool, and the sky was a brilliant shade of orange as I stepped out of the car. It should have been perfect. But as soon as I looked at that cabin, a chill crept down my spine. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, I was going to be out here alone, and I hadn't spent much time in places this isolated. The air smelled clean, crisp, like pine and fresh water, and I was ready to unwind. The cabin itself was basic, just a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living room with a worn-out couch and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. As night fell, I built a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book. The silence was almost suffocating. I could hear every creak of the wood, every gust of wind rattling the windows. For the first few hours, I kept glancing up, half expecting to see something moving outside, but all I could see were shadows cast by the fire. After a while, I managed to calm down, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like footsteps crunching on gravel. I froze, listening, but the sound faded as quickly as it had started. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal passing by, but the footsteps had sounded deliberate, like someone walking in a circle around the cabin. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my book, but the sound came back. This time, it was louder and closer. My heart was pounding as I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the dark. The moon was full, casting a silver light over the lake, but there was no sign of anyone, just the trees and the water, calm and still. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination, and went back to the couch. But the sound returned, and this time, it was followed by a soft tapping on the window. I jumped, nearly dropping my book. The tapping was rhythmic, slow, and steady, like someone was trying to get my attention. I forced myself to look out the window again, and this time, I saw it. A figure was standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, with long, thin limbs, and a shadowy outline that seemed to blend into the forest. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me through the window. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but I knew what I'd seen. I grabbed my phone, but as I'd expected, there was no signal. I was alone out here, and that thing, whatever it was, it knew I was alone. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in place, staring back at it, but eventually it disappeared, melting into the shadows. I felt a wave of relief, telling myself it was gone, that I was safe. But the silence was heavier now, almost oppressive, and every creak and rustle sounded like footsteps. I barely slept that night. I sat by the fire, wide awake, my eyes darting to the window every few minutes. When morning finally came, the relief was overwhelming. I stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air, trying to shake off the fear from the night before. The lake was beautiful in the daylight, calm and serene, and for a while, I convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But when night fell again, The fear crept back in. I tried to focus on my book, pretending I wasn't waiting for the sound to return. But as soon as the last light faded from the sky, I heard it. The same footsteps, circling the cabin. They were slower this time, like whoever or whatever was out there was taking its time, enjoying the fear it was causing. I felt my hands shaking as I listened, every nerve in my body telling me to run, but I was too terrified to move. Then, the tapping started again, louder and more insistent. I forced myself to look, and there it was, the figure, closer this time, standing just outside the window, its face hidden in shadow. But as I watched, it moved, pressing its hand against the glass, leaving a dark, smudged print. I stumbled back, grabbing the first thing I could find, a flashlight, and shone it at the window. The figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, staring at me, its hand pressed against the glass. I could barely make out its features, but there was something wrong with its face, like it wasn't fully formed, like it was shifting, trying to mimic a human face, but not quite getting it right. And then, it smiled. The smile was too wide, stretching across its face in an unnatural way, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. My blood turned to ice. I felt like I was being pulled toward the window, like that smile was dragging me in, consuming me. I broke away, stumbling back into the bedroom and slamming the door shut. I huddled in the corner, my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound of the tapping, which had grown louder, more desperate. It felt like the whole cabin was vibrating, like the walls were closing in on me. I don't know how long I stayed there, paralyzed with fear. The tapping eventually stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I stayed in that corner, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When dawn finally came, I crept out of the bedroom, my heart pounding. The cabin was silent, the lake outside calm and beautiful, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked at the window, the handprint was still there, a dark, smudged mark on the glass, proof that I hadn't imagined it. I grabbed my things, threw them into the car, and didn't look back. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But the road stayed empty, the cabin disappearing behind me, swallowed by the forest. I haven't told anyone what happened that night. I'm not sure they'd believe me, or if I even believe it myself. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear that tapping again, soft and rhythmic, like it's coming from just outside my window. And I know it's still watching, waiting for the day I'll come back to Willow Lake.
The Haunting of Cedar Ridge, a cabin in the deep woods. I don't know why I thought a solo trip to a remote cabin was a good idea. It's not like I'm the type of guy who thrives in isolation. I'm a city person at heart, but after everything that had been happening, the job stress, a rough breakup, and the constant noise of urban life, I just wanted a break. Some time to think, to figure things out. Maybe even start writing in the journal my therapist had given me but that I'd never used. I found Cedar Ridge Cabin through a rental site. The description promised total seclusion, beautiful mountain views, and a perfect escape from the noise of everyday life. It seemed like exactly what I needed. The cabin was in a secluded corner of the Rockies in Colorado, miles from the nearest town. The directions were clear, but as I got closer, the roads turned to rough, narrow trails, barely fit for my car. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already getting dark, the sun just a glimmer behind the mountains. The cabin was smaller than I expected, a single room with a kitchen nook, a bed pushed against one wall, and a small, old-fashioned fireplace. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns and a stock of firewood. But the view out the front window was stunning. A dense forest of pines, stretching as far as I could see, with mountain peaks visible in the distance. It was beautiful, peaceful, exactly what I needed. The first night was calm. I cooked a simple meal, lit a lantern, and tried to read, though I kept glancing out the window at the darkening forest. The silence was intense. In the city, you get used to constant noise, but here, there was nothing. Just the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Around midnight, I finally turned in, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I had the unsettling feeling of being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Eventually, I drifted off, but I woke up several times, my heart racing, listening to every tiny sound. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I went for a hike, taking in the scenery, breathing in the fresh air. The forest was beautiful during the day, a sea of towering trees and sunlight streaming through the branches. By the time I got back to the cabin, I felt a bit more relaxed, almost foolish for letting the quiet of the night get to me. But as soon as the sun started setting, the feeling came back, stronger this time. I lit a fire in the fireplace, hoping the warm glow would make me feel more comfortable. But as night fell, the silence grew heavier, almost oppressive. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting. I kept glancing out the window, convinced that something was out there, just beyond the line of trees, watching. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A faint tapping on the window. My body froze. The tapping was slow, rhythmic, almost gentle, like someone was drumming their fingers. I turned to look, half expecting to see someone standing outside, but there was nothing, just the reflection of the firelight flickering against the glass. I told myself it had to be a branch or maybe some animal, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The tapping stopped, and silence filled the cabin again. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any other sound, but there was nothing. After a while, I managed to convince myself it was nothing, and I forced myself to lie down, though I knew sleep was out of the question. The tapping started again, louder this time. My heart was pounding as I sat up, staring at the window, and then I saw it. A shadow just outside the window, half hidden in the darkness. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long limbs and a hunched posture, like it was leaning closer to peer inside. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze boring into me from the darkness. I stumbled out of bed, my mind racing. I wanted to run to get as far from that cabin as I could, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring. Finally, I forced myself to look away, grabbing my keys and my flashlight. I decided I'd leave right then and there, no matter how dark it was outside. I headed for the door, but as soon as I reached it, the tapping started again, louder and more insistent, like it knew I was trying to leave. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, listening. The tapping grew faster, more frantic, as if something was desperate to get inside. And then, from somewhere deep within the forest, I heard a voice. "Don't go." The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they cut through the silence like a knife. It was a voice I didn't recognize, low, raspy, and filled with something dark, something that made my skin crawl. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest, and looked out the window again. The shadow was gone. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fireplace, clutching the flashlight, my eyes fixed on the window. The tapping continued on and off, stopping just long enough for me to think it was over before starting again. I didn't dare sleep, didn't dare move. I just sat there waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, the tapping stopped and the shadow was gone. I stepped outside, taking deep breaths of the morning air, but the unease lingered. The forest looked different in the daylight, normal, even inviting. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I packed my things as quickly as I could and left, not looking back. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadow following me down the mountain. But the road stayed empty, and by the time I reached the main highway, I began to feel a little more at ease. It's been months since that trip, but I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me back. Every so often in the dead of night, I hear that same soft tapping on my apartment window, even though I live on the 4th floor. I tell myself it's nothing, that it's just my mind playing tricks, but I can't help but remember that voice in the forest. Don't go. And I know, deep down, that whatever I saw at Cedar Ridge hasn't let me go. It's still out there waiting, and every so often it finds its way back to me.
The shadows of Birchwood, a solitary retreat turned nightmare. It was my friend Sarah who first told me about Birchwood Cabin. She said it was the perfect spot if you wanted to get away from everything, hidden deep in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I wasn't usually the type to crave solitude, but after the year I'd had, the idea of disconnecting completely sounded like exactly what I needed. No electricity, no cell service, and no people for miles. It was just what I wanted. So, I packed light, just the basics, clothes, some canned food, and a flashlight. I left my phone and laptop at home, determined to spend a weekend without a single distraction. The drive up was beautiful, winding roads through forests that seemed to get denser with each mile. The last stretch was a rough, narrow dirt road that climbed steeply through the woods. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows between the trees. Birchwood Cabin was smaller than I'd imagined, an old wooden structure that looked like it had been there for 100 years. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall, ancient pines that seemed to loom over it like sentinels. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an intense, heavy silence. But I told myself that was part of the appeal. I wanted quiet, right? The inside was even more rustic than I'd expected. Just one main room with a bed, a small wood stove, and a table with 2 worn-out chairs. The air was stale and smelled faintly of dust and something else I couldn't quite place. But I shook it off. I was here to relax, to breathe in the mountain air and finally get some peace. As night fell, I lit a lantern and set up my things. There was no way to distract myself, no TV, no phone, so I pulled out a book and settled down to read by the flickering light. Outside, the darkness was absolute. The shadows of the trees pressed up against the windows, and every now and then I'd look up, half expecting to see something, or someone, staring back at me. But each time it was just the darkness, endless and silent. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had been building up all evening. It felt like the cabin was watching me, like it was waiting. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I wasn't used to being this isolated. But I couldn't shake it. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had stirred me at first, but then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from outside. It was slow, deliberate, almost like someone knocking on the side of the cabin. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding. The tapping continued, moving along the wall toward the window. I sat up, barely daring to breathe, staring at the window. The light from the lantern was dim, casting strange shadows on the walls, and for a moment I thought I saw something. A figure, tall and thin, just outside, barely visible in the darkness. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the shadows, but the tapping didn't stop. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window. The beam illuminated the glass, but beyond it I saw nothing, just darkness, no figure, no shadow. I breathed a sigh of relief, telling myself it was just the wind or a branch tapping against the cabin. But as I settled back into bed, the tapping returned, louder this time, more insistent. I lay there, frozen, listening as the tapping moved around the cabin, like something was circling it, trying to find a way in. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong about it, something deliberate. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, listening, waiting. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and the silence returned. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was heavy, suffocating, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. When dawn finally broke, I went outside to check for tracks, anything that could explain the noises from the night before. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of anyone or anything. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. The day passed quietly. I spent most of it by the lake, breathing in the fresh air, trying to relax. But as the sun started to set, the dread crept back in. The cabin felt different now, like a cage closing in around me. That night I tried to distract myself with my book again, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to the window, to the trees outside, where shadows were gathering, growing longer as the night deepened. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing out there. But just as I started to calm down, I heard it again. The tapping. It was louder this time, more insistent, like whoever or whatever was outside was trying to make sure I knew they were there. My hands were shaking as I picked up the flashlight, shining it toward the window. But this time, when the light hit the glass, I saw it. A figure, standing just outside the cabin, its face inches from the window. Its features were twisted, distorted, almost human, but wrong. Its eyes were dark, empty, and its mouth was stretched into a twisted grin that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, and the beam flickered, casting the room into shadows. I heard the tapping again, now on the door, slow and steady, like it was inviting itself inside. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, as the handle turned slowly, creaking. The door didn't open, but the figure outside didn't go away. It just kept tapping, moving around the cabin, from window to window, its shadow stretching across the glass, distorted and twisted. I felt like I was trapped, unable to escape its gaze. The tapping stopped after what felt like hours, but I didn't sleep. I just sat there, my back against the wall, staring at the door, waiting. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When the first light of dawn finally broke, I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't care if I'd only been there a couple of days. I needed to leave, to get as far from that cabin as possible. I drove away without looking back, but even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that same rhythmic tapping, soft but insistent, like it's just outside my apartment, waiting to be let in. And every so often, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a twisted, shadowy figure with empty eyes, and a grin that doesn't belong on any human face. I try to tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks, that I'm still shaken from that weekend. But deep down, I know it's real. That cabin, that shadow, it's still watching, waiting for the moment I'll finally let it in.
The Curse of Blackwood Cabin. A weekend escape gone wrong. I'm not sure what made me choose Blackwood Cabin. Maybe it was the name, or maybe I just wanted to be somewhere remote, somewhere no one could find me. I'd been feeling overwhelmed with work and personal drama, so the idea of spending a few days completely alone in the mountains seemed perfect. Just me, a good book, and absolute silence. The cabin was nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains in Washington, so far off the beaten path that there wasn't even a marked road to get there. The listing mentioned that it was a perfect escape for those seeking solitude, and boasted about the scenic forest views and total isolation. The photos showed a cozy, rustic cabin surrounded by thick woods with a river nearby. It sounded like exactly what I needed. After a 4-hour drive, I reached the turnoff that led to the cabin. The road was little more than a narrow dirt trail winding through dense trees. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin looked just like the photos. Small and quaint, with a stone chimney and wooden porch that overlooked the trees. I got out of the car and took a deep breath, letting the cool, pine-scented air wash over me. It was so quiet, so still, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. I unloaded my bags, brought them inside, and set up a small fire in the fireplace. The cabin had an old-fashioned feel to it. Everything was made of dark wood, and the only light came from the fire and a couple of oil lamps that had been left behind. That first night was calm. I cooked a simple meal, poured myself a glass of wine, and settled down on the couch with a book. The quiet was almost overwhelming, but I told myself that's why I was here, to unplug, to unwind. Outside, the forest was pitch black, the trees barely visible in the dim light from the cabin windows. I closed my book and gazed out into the darkness, feeling a strange pull, like the trees were hiding something just beyond my line of sight. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling. Every creak seemed louder, more pronounced, like the cabin was alive, breathing. I tried to brush it off, but something about the place felt off, like I wasn't truly alone. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed. I spent the day hiking through the forest and sitting by the river with my journal, trying to gather my thoughts. The solitude was peaceful in the daylight, and I found myself relaxing, slowly letting go of the stress I'd carried with me. But as the sun began to set, that strange feeling of unease crept back in. I was inside, preparing dinner, when I noticed it. A faint humming sound, like someone was singing far off in the distance. It was soft, almost like a lullaby, drifting through the trees. I turned off the stove and stood still, listening. The sound seemed to grow closer, echoing through the woods, filling the cabin with an eerie, haunting melody. I told myself it was just the wind, that the isolation was getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone, or something, out there. I forced myself to ignore it, trying to lose myself in my book again, but as night fell, the humming grew louder, and a new sound joined it. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, crunching through the fallen leaves outside. I sat frozen, clutching the edge of the couch, straining to hear. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving slowly, almost like someone was pacing. My heart pounded as I watched the windows, waiting for something, anything, to appear. But there was nothing, just shadows dancing across the glass, cast by the flickering firelight. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and silence returned. I exhaled, trying to calm my racing heart, but the silence was almost worse. It was heavy, pressing in on me, suffocating. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But when I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on the window. I lay still, holding my breath, listening as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was rhythmic, almost like someone knocking in a pattern. My heart pounded as I turned my head, my eyes barely able to make out the window in the darkness. I could see a shape, something tall and thin standing just outside, its outline barely visible against the trees. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light. But as I lay there, the tapping became a scratching sound, like nails dragging across the glass. I pulled the blanket up over my head, closing my eyes, willing myself to fall back asleep. But the scratching only grew louder, more frantic. It felt like it was inside my head, like it was trying to break through. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I lay there, wide awake, my heart racing, until the first light of dawn. When I finally gathered the courage to look out the window, there was nothing there. Just the forest, silent and empty. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But that evening, as soon as darkness fell, the humming and footsteps returned, louder and more insistent than before. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the window, but the beam only illuminated the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, with limbs that looked too long, too thin, and a face that was obscured by darkness. But I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the figure took a step forward and then another, its movements slow and deliberate. It stopped just a few feet from the cabin, its face tilting as if trying to peer through the window. In a panic, I grabbed my things, threw on my jacket, and bolted out the door. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night, that I had to drive down that narrow dirt road in the dark. I just needed to get out of there. I ran to my car, threw my bags into the back seat, and sped down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the road watching me leave. Its face was still obscured, but I could make out that twisted, unnatural smile, like it was satisfied, like it knew I'd be back. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. Even then, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure standing in the shadows. I haven't been back to Blackwood cabin since, and I never will. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up to the faint sound of tapping on my window, and I know it's still out there, watching, waiting. And if you ever find yourself in the Cascades, near Blackwood cabin, take my advice. Keep driving, because once you've seen it, once it knows you, it never lets go.